Hello, my name is Hartland Ross, and I'm the president of eBridge Marketing and the host broker. And in this session, I want to talk about the sell side process. We get a lot of questions and calls from various groups, sellers who are considering selling their business or who have committed to the process and want to understand a little bit more, not only about the process more generally, but also specifically about working with us and what they can expect. So I wanted to talk about what that looks like, and I'm going to go through a number of elements of that process. I'll just start with a quick introduction on us. We started about 20 years ago as a marketing firm focused on IT companies, and sort of broadened our scope into the M&A space, specifically focused on managed service providers, MSPs, web hosts, data center operators, more generally IT service firms, and are quite active in the secondary market selling IP address blocks. So we started as a result of client demand. Groups that were looking to grow organically found that and continue to find that costs for growing organically in some cases might not make sense. And of course, from a speed perspective, acquisitions is a faster way to grow, and so approached us as a fairly kind of a well-connected group in the space to see if we might be able to help. And so that sort of spawned our jump start into the M&A space with respect to IT firms about 15 years ago. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Contact information is on the slide, and happy to have a more individualized conversation. But covering some of the more general questions and topics that we get is really the focus of what I want to cover in this session. So first of all, it's very important as a seller to understand why you're considering selling. So what are your objectives? Is it because you want retirement? Is it because you're burnt out? Is it because you feel that you still love the space, but that you're struggling with respect to capital requirements, or maybe it's a skill set issue that you love doing the piece that you kind of are most talented at, whether that be from a technical perspective or maybe it's sales and marketing, but wearing all the hats is become a bit too much for you. So perhaps you're looking for a sort of an acquirer to retain you on at some level, and to have them take over some of the elements that you're not so keen on. Maybe there's a health issue, unfortunately, and we certainly have encountered those situations over the years. Valuation expectations. This is a retirement exercise. How much do you need to retire? Have you thought about that? What does that look like from a timeline perspective? What about your involvement from a perspective of helping the buyer go on a go-forward basis? Are you looking to stick around for 6 months, a year, or is it more of a sort of a transition period and then you'd like to be gone? Is there a leadership team in place that can run the business on a day-to-day basis such that really you're not too involved and not needed from a buyer's perspective? What about tax implications? This is very important. The time just before negotiating and receiving an offer, negotiating that offer is not the time to start number crunching and realize that, geez, I'm getting that $3 million check, but I'm actually going to only be able to take home $1.5 million of that, and that's a lot less than I thought or than I need for my retirement, or if you're looking to fund another business, for example, or something, or even pay off debt. That may not be sufficient. And so the time to figure that out is before you go down that path and have a conversation with your accountant, your CPA. Timelines, sort of touched on that to some degree, but is this just a matter of, look, if someone makes me a decent offer that's workable tomorrow, I'm willing to sell tomorrow, or is this something that you're just looking to explore so you understand what's involved, and that your timeline is sort of sometime to get out sometime in the next year or two? Also, it might be that this might be a good approach to look at as somewhat of a soft landing for yourself for a retirement situation. So you might say, well, I'm not really interested in stopping working tomorrow, but I would like to kind of have my ducks in a row. So if I can find a buyer and then I can work for that buyer for 2, 3, 4 years, then I know that I've already sold the business, I'm involved in the business, I'm still making income, I'm being challenged, I've got something to do every day and not drive my partner nuts. And this then allows me to kind of walk off at that point, and everything's been teed up, and maybe there's even a portion that of equity that you retain in the business, and then the buyer ultimately takes you out entirely at 100%, down the road. And then also, who do you think would be the ideal prospect and buyer? So is that a strategic buyer, someone who's already in the space? If so, is it that there's a specialization in industry that you bring that a buyer would also need to have? Are there some credentials that are required to service your customer base that a buyer would need to have as well on their team? Or perhaps they can acquire your team to be able to maintain those credentials and certifications and whatnot. Is there a opportunity here for someone to open up a new market, and so a group that might be looking to expand from where they are, and they're within 2-3 hours or something, and now this gives them a footprint a little further afield and boots on the ground, so to speak. Or might the buyer be a financially motivated buyer, private equity group or otherwise, who might be looking at your business as either a platform, meaning that you have the systems and processes in place with a large enough team and a large enough book of business that they can now start using that to either get into the market or open up a new market if they're not, in the line of business, MSP or whatnot already. This might give them the ability to open that up. Maybe there's some cross-selling opportunities for them. Or if it's a smaller book of business, then perhaps your business could be looked at as a tuck-in, meaning that they already have an existing larger operation, a platform running somewhere else, and your business is a perfect tuck-in for their existing business, and now they've got boots on the ground in a new market, or there's some additional expertise that might be able to be secured. The next piece to talk about is with respect to valuation. So have you had any conversations with respect to valuations with anybody, your accountants, colleagues, peers, others who might have an opinion on the value of your IT service firms? There is some variability, of course, not only within the type of IT firm that you operate, but also with respect to the size itself and location and whatnot. So there's a number of different factors, and we'll talk about those things. Generally speaking, web hosting is valued as a multiple of recurring revenue, and specifically revenue, not earnings, not EBITDA, not income, but top line revenue. And generally the rationale for that is that those who are buying a web hosting company are looking to acquire the customers, but the vast majority, if not almost all of the costs, will end up going away because the expenses, because a buyer will have relationships already in place to be able to service those customers and really don't need your structure. So the vendors that they're using, they'll have their own relationships such that they may not even incur additional costs to bring on those customers and support them. If they do, chances are they're bigger and they have preferential pricing, so what you're paying is going to be more in many cases than what the buyer is already paying. They may have their preferred vendors, so some of those vendors aren't needed. They may even own some proprietary system technologies that render some of the tools that you're using, whether it be billing, for instance, control panels, etc., rendering those unnecessary. If you are a managed service provider, an MSP, a little bit different. Those businesses are valued as more of a turnkey operation, in which case, although there's going to be some consolidation of expenses, the vast majority of those expenses will remain. There's some consolidation and sort of tiering that goes on with respect to expenses, so that some of those customers may be able to be onboarded and there's no additional expenses that are going to be incurred to support them, but many of them will remain. And so as a result, the buyers are going to be looking at MSPs as an exercise in generating additional profitability, and so they're going to be looking at bottom line numbers. And so specifically looking at adjusted EBITDA, which is your net income, removing your interest, depreciation, taxes, and amortization, and then adding back any one-time expenses, one-time revenues, non-recurring items, and as also adjusting for any personal expenses or additional, for instance, typically it's going to be a salary that a seller may be paying himself that is above or below market, needs to be adjusted. And if you're looking at IPv4 blocks in the secondary market, currently those numbers are around $40 an IP, but do move up and down. They've dropped down a little bit in the last year or so. So what does the process look like from more of a sort of paperwork and onboarding exercise? So the first thing is that, of course, confidentiality needs to be maintained, and there's a non-disclosure agreement that would be signed between you as the seller and any prospective buyer. So that's step one. And in terms of having conversations with us, obviously, if that information is confidential, and we're happy to talk about and have conversations on anything that you'd like. The more information that you give us, the more specific we can be about your situation. But in terms of looking at the process of kind of moving forward with selling exercise and having conversations with buyers, rest assured that a non-disclosure agreement would be in place, and that the information sharing process can take the form of a number of different sort of methodologies, but certainly there's oftentimes a layering process where there's a first package that will go out, and that doesn't tell everybody everything, but gives them enough to evaluate the business initially and understand whether there might be a fit for them. We have an agreement with all of our buyers and sellers, and so we would need to get that agreement in place with you as a prospective seller. We are in most cases paid a fee by the buyer, so you as a seller would not cover our fee. There are some exceptions which I can explain on a one-on-one conversation, but by and large we're paid a success fee. We're paid by the buyer, and we are certainly not paid by both buyer and seller at the same time. So it's one or the other, but by and large it's by the buyer. And then we have documentation that we've created to kind of speed this process up and make it easy for sellers to put together a listing with us. And it's really more of a kind of question and answer exercise, because we specifically work with IT service firms. We're not having to create documentation and materials for all sorts of industries. We can zero in on IT services, and the fact that we've been doing this for as long as we have, we know what buyers are typically looking for, and we've therefore created documentation that asks you as a prospective seller questions that we know that buyers will ask. And that makes it easier for you as a seller, because you're not having to repeat the same information over and over again. So we have kind of a summary, more of a, I guess, qualitative document that discusses the business, and then the quantitative elements in terms of some reports, namely, of course, financials, but also some other files that we would request from you. So the information package that goes out, so sometimes this is referred to the SIM or confidential information memorandum, the materials, you may hear it referred to in a few different ways, but we put together an overview document. As I mentioned, it's in a question and answer style format and covers some of the following areas. So there's a sort of a general information and background about the business, a bit about operations and your team, and how you provide the services and how you support your customers, a little bit about your billing, how do you bill them, whether it be time and materials, whether there be a recurring managed services agreement contract, and what those terms look like. some of the more technical aspects of the business. Is there a data center lease or ownership involved in your business? Financials and a review of those, and then specifically kind of deal elements in terms of what you're looking for in terms of a deal structure. So to produce the package, we're going to look at wanting to do the adjusted financials, as we talked about, looking at identifying the EBITDA figure and making the adjustments that I mentioned earlier for one-time events and personal expenses and so forth, and end up creating an annualized and deferred revenue calculation. So deferred revenue typically applies more, we see in the hosting space than it does in managed services, but these are situations where a customer may pay for services in advance. So if they were to prepay for a year, prepay for 6 months, prepay for 3 years, then there's going to be the liability associated with that future service agreement, and that liability will then need to be assumed by the buyer. And so typically buyers will adjust for deferred revenue. Again, this primarily occurs in hosting firms more so than managed service providers. If there is a deferred revenue element to it, then that would be adjusted from the purchase price. Namely, it would be removed as part of the valuation. So we typically see adjustments for deferred revenue for customers who are prepaying for periods in excess of 1 year. If it's less than 1 year for hosting, we typically don't see that adjusted. If it's for a managed service provider, typically it would be for periods that exceed 1 month. So if the customers were prepaying for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 months or more, then those would be adjusted. And so we're going to want to go through those exercises. We're going to want to review the P&Ls for the last 3 years, and the company overview document that I referred to earlier will address elements of or some elements of the financial package. And then we're also going to be looking for, in the case of MSPs, a detailed spreadsheet covering all of the customers and the terms that they're on when they sign contracts, if that in fact is the case, and the amount that they're paying, the services that they're getting, and when they started their relationship with you, and when that contract renews. If it's a hosting company, then there are exports out of the billing system that will provide this same level of information. So we get questions from prospective sellers that are interested in understanding how their business will be promoted. And first of all, the business gets typically listed in most cases in our weekly mailing, and we mail out to a few thousand prospective buyers of IT firms globally, although the vast majority of buyers and frankly also sellers are located in the United States. Our mailings go out on Wednesday mornings Pacific time. And in addition to that, we also will include the mailing in some cases, or the listing in some cases via our partner brokers. And we will do, in some cases, targeted outreach to specific groups and specific markets that we feel might be interested in looking at the opportunity. And we may also leverage some third-party mergers and acquisitions related sites. I think it's important to note, though, that in all cases, the listing is generic in nature. So the references are going to be to West Coast, East Coast, Southwest, Mid-Atlantic, etc. Businesses, rather than anything too specific that would allow buyers to identify who the business is or the business name. So obviously the business name would not be used. We typically will talk about some of the high-level important elements of the business that a buyer will need to know in order to decide whether this might be the right fit for them, and that is going to be summarized in 3, 4, maybe 5 sentences. Once the mailing goes out or the promotion is made and prospective buyers make inquiries, then the next thing that they need to do is sign a non-disclosure agreement. And that non-disclosure agreement, of course, be between you as the seller and a prospective buyer. And then there may be reasons to further screen the buyers to make sure that there's the right fit. And so I talked earlier about perhaps there's some certifications that need to be held. Perhaps it's important to understand that there is a requirement to service customers on site, and that there needs to be people on the ground who can service those customers versus a business that can be run remotely. So does the buyer understand that, and is that a relevant factor for them? Obviously, do they have the financial wherewithal to be able to facilitate a transaction? If there are discussions to be had around valuation expectations, that's important. And sometimes there are going to be nuanced elements around employees or you as a seller and your preferences for staying on or not staying on, or timelines or whatnot that might need to be conveyed. And so once the buyers are put through the process and have prospective buyers have a real opportunity to potentially be interested in it, then the package is shared, the package being, again, that confidential information memorandum and all of the associated documentation that goes with that. So the next step is for buyers to try to get more information beyond what has been provided in the package that we provide. And of course, we do our best to try to put together information that we know that buyers are looking for, but inevitably there'll be more specific questions and they'll need to understand that in more detail. And how do they do that? So they can do that in a combination of emailed questions that they'll send through us, or potentially a phone call, or both. And in some cases, it might even make sense to have an in-person meeting, particularly in situations where somebody's either in the same market or travels to that region on a regular basis, or happens to be there next week and would like to meet with you as a prospective seller. So first step, though, is to get their initial questions answered. And as I say, that may take place via email or a phone call. Phone calls would typically last no more than an hour with introductions made, and then questions about the business. There may be questions that you as a seller may not be able to answer on the call, and that's okay. It's fine just to say, look, I'll run that report, or I'll have to check with our accountants and get back to you. But primarily, these are going to be questions that will be easy for you as a seller to answer. And then as we go through that process, inevitably some buyers will be interested and learning more. They might want a second call. They might want an in-person meeting if they haven't had one, or even a second in-person meeting. And as that process goes along, some of the buyers will inevitably find that it's not the right fit for them and opt out, but others will continue along on the process. And so then it moves into the stage of evaluating the different buyers, and I always encourage sellers to evaluate the buyers as much as the buyers are evaluating you and your business as a option for them. You as the seller also need to ensure that you are selecting a buyer that's going to be a good fit, and that it often is more than just a matter of who's providing the highest bid, but that fit typically covers things like who's going to support your customers the best, who's going to, what group is going to have the best cultural fit for your staff, your team. Cultural fit will also translate into experiences that the customers have, because if the employees are happy, then they're going to be doing a better job, and systems will be better, processes will be better, and the customers will have a better experience. So those two are very tightly connected, and often sellers feel that although money is important, that they really want to make sure that their customers are taken care of. In a lot of cases, and you may be able to identify this with this as well as a seller, is that you've got relationships with your customers that may extend beyond just a business relationship, and there may be a friendship there at some level, including the fact that maybe actually be friends and family that are part of your customer base. So Other things that often come into play as well is speed at which a transaction can be completed, competency in completing other transactions, the deal structure itself, not just the valuation, but if the valuation is to be paid in payment terms that span the period of 10 years, for instance, and another group might make a lower offer, but it's all paid out in 6 months, it may make more sense to go with the 6-month offer. And obviously I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but payment terms are an important aspect as well. So after these become available, these offers, and you've evaluated them, then ultimately you would decide presumably on one of them, although that may not always be the case. It may be that none of them are relevant for you, but typically there's going to be at least one, and it's a matter of evaluating which one, and sometimes that's a bit of a difficult exercise in and of itself. But that process ultimately concludes in the signing of a letter of intent or term sheet, which is a non-binding outline of the key deal terms, and that the fact that it's non-binding doesn't mean that you want to take that lightly, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that it's locked in stone for either side. The buyer may decide that it's not the right fit for them, or run into issues that they didn't anticipate prior to the signing of the letter of intent. I would say that the vast majority of opportunities that get signed, where a letter of intent is signed, do end up closing, but it's certainly not a done deal, and it's one of those old sayings that you don't want to count your chickens until they all hatch. So what's the next step? You've got a letter of intent or term sheet now signed, and now what happens? So the buyer now needs to pull back the covers a little bit more and check under the hood for elements that they would not have completed prior to this point. So this might be things like certainly looking at a more detailed review of the financials is typically where it's going to start. So it may be getting an audit done, it may be doing this process internally or hiring an external firm. It might be a quality of earnings exercise, but nonetheless, there's going to be a financial due diligence exercise there. Typically, that's where things will start, but then they'll move into operational and legal elements as well, and relevant documentation will be shared to support those things: lease contracts, relationships with the employees and or any firms, vendors, etc. that are engaged, the terms of those relationships, and how customers are handled, and any kind of nuanced elements around the customer base themselves. Are there any customers who have got special requirements? Are there any customers who might pose a potential risk for a buyer? Typically, those are going to be ones that are representing a large portion of the revenue, or where there might be some reasons to believe that a customer might end up leaving. So those things are going to be explored, and there may be a portal of some sort, a data room set up. It could be as simple as Dropbox or a Google file that ends up being a folder that gets shared. Some cases it's a more industry-specific deal room that's used. In any event, that information is shared. At that point, there'll be a lot of back and forth between you as a seller and a prospective buyer. Typically, our role at this point is not as active. We're typically involved when there are issues that come up, and to try to help both sides to navigate those issues if that's possible, and obviously, hopefully it is. And also to review the, and I forgot to mention previously, but we would review the term sheet and letter of intent. But ultimately, as the purchase agreement draft gets produced, we would be reviewing that as well. So the purchase agreement is now going to far more detail related to the elements of the transaction. So it would reflect what was already agreed to, at least in the vast majority of cases, unless it's reason that those things should have changed from the original term sheet. It will be a reflection of the term sheet, deal terms, and then of course a lot more detail. The vast majority of IT firms are sold as an asset purchase rather than a stock or share deal, if you prefer. But the odd ones are done for various reasons as a stock deal. But as I say, sort of 95+% of the time, probably quite a bit more actually than that, it's going to end up being an asset purchase agreement that will be negotiated. And to that end, it's important for you as a seller to have an attorney, lawyer as part of your team, and to have established that relationship prior to the purchase agreement being delivered and requiring the review by your attorney. So they should be kind of brought in earlier in the process so that they're aware of the timelines and to expect this, rather than dumping it on their desk with no notice and saying that you'd like it reviewed within 2 or 3 days. So the next step is the closing, and typically the transactions that we're involved with end up being done as a simultaneous close. That means that the agreement is signed and closed at exactly the same time, on the same day, as opposed to a deferred closing where it might be signed today, and then for instance, if it's going to close on the 1st of the month, that's 2 or 3 weeks from now, and so we'll sign today and then we'll close in a few weeks once we hit the 1st of the month. That's not the way that these deals are typically done. Most of them are done as a simultaneous sign and close. So the draft we talked about in the last slide here related to reviewing of the purchase agreements. So there's the legal review of the purchase agreements, and there's a fair bit of back and forth that will be involved with that, including producing of all of the schedules or exhibits, and those need to be populated. In most cases, those items are going to be coming from the seller, so a list of customers, a list of vendor contracts, etc., and assets that are to be sold, and items that are going to be retained and therefore not sold, liabilities that are going to be assumed and those that are not going to be assumed. So all those things are listed, and the agreement is populated, and once both sides agree on all elements and language, then that agreement is going to be signed. And then the moment it's signed, the buyer will initiate the first payment under the payment terms that are outlined in the agreement. And once that happens and proof of that payment has been made, and typically if it's a wire payment, there's a Fed reference number that you can obtain from the buyer as a seller proof of funds, or in the odd case, I've seen them done in person where the two groups will go to the bank together and there'll be a transfer made. But a wire is a more common way to do it. The other option is to use one of the attorneys as an escrow agent, and so funds are sent to the attorney, and once the confirmation that those funds have been received, and then the seller is obligated to disclose all of the key. They essentially provide the keys to the vault. So transferring all of the assets, including logins and all the conditions precedent to close that are going to be required, and notifications will go out if appropriate to customers, to employees, to vendors, etc. So the next step is post-closing and the support that's going to be required. So it's not typically going to be that the seller ends up receiving the funds, provides all of the login credentials, etc., and then heads to the beach, never to be seen again. That's not normally the way these things roll out. Typically, the buyer is going to require some kind of post-closing transition support, and that would be outlined, if not at a verbal understanding of the LOI, it would certainly be outlined in the purchase agreement and closing documentation in terms of what expectations are there. Is there any paid support? And on the assumption that you as a seller aren't going to be sticking around as an employee or a consultant, at the very least, you're going to need to be available to answer any questions. and it may involve you getting involved to support customers, their questions, their concerns. In the event that the deal is structured where there's an earn-out element, that earn-out will mean that it will be to your in your best interests to be able to ensure that customers stick around, because earn-out means that you will not get paid if the revenue isn't realized, and if the revenue from those customers is in jeopardy, then it's going to be in your best interest to try to ensure that those customers stick around and continue to pay their bills. So providing post-closing transition support for some period of time, that will typically be heaviest, obviously, in the first few days, first week, maybe 2 weeks, and then steadily decline over time. Usually by a month, if not even earlier. There's not a whole lot for the seller to do, but issues may come up, questions may arise, and the buyer will want to continue to have you be available at some level. And there may be an amount of time each week that's agreed to, and as a cap, and time exceeding that amount is compensated, or it just may be that it's not available. And that those the time that's being agreed to is typically on a somewhat of a declining sort of schedule, if you like, over the course of the first 4, 6, 8 weeks. And then there'll be the subsequent payments, assuming that that's applicable, but in most cases it is. So you're not getting 100% of the payment on close, you're going to get a certain percentage, and that typically is in the 40 to 80% range on close, and then the balance of the payments are going to happen over some period of time. And so those subsequent payments will come in. If there's an earn-out element, then there needs to be some reporting around, okay, what was the earn-out based on? Did these customers stick around? Did they not? When did they leave? Did they downgrade their service level? And if so, what does that look like? So some kind of shared documentation to outline that, and have an agreed earn-out payment structure, and ensuring that those payments are continuing to come in is kind of part of our role. So post-close, maintaining communication with both you as a seller and also with the buyer, and to ensure that things are going smoothly and as agreed to. So I think one of the things that's really important in this whole process, and even more generally, is just related to expectations. So expectations from all sides, and as a seller, what can you expect? And specifically, what can you expect from a timeline perspective? How long might this take? How much of my time would be involved, and so forth. So I always like to cover this because I think it's important. And of course, this is based on our general experiences. Doesn't mean to say that something can't take longer, or frankly may take less time. But typically what we would see is a 4 to 6 week period initially to gather interested groups. So that's from the point at which a listing goes out, it would take 4 to 6 weeks to get inquiries, to have groups ask questions, to set up calls, to set up in-person meetings, gather information, and get those buyers to the point where they have the ability to make offers. And then there's a period of another couple of weeks where they would make offers, and you as a seller would be evaluating those offers. You may wish to have a subsequent call with them, or provide some questions that we can help get answers to. It will help you to decide whether they might be the right fit, and then in turn whether that's the best offer for you. And then moving into the sort of 6 to 8 week period for due diligence. And that period is post signing of the letter of intent, and at that point you're in a no shop exclusivity period. So you as a seller can't be talking to other buyers. You're in an exclusive relationship, allowing that buyer to be able to get in there and do their due diligence. I mentioned earlier the financial due diligence is typically where this starts. So that's going to take 6 to 8 weeks. But it's possible it could take longer. So it's a month and a half to 2 months. But certainly if the opportunity and your business was either more complicated or larger, it wouldn't be uncommon for that to be 3 months. and in some cases it could even be 4 months, but I would say the vast majority are going to be around 60 days, so 8 weeks or so, and looking at the whole process being somewhere in the 3 to 5 month range before the deal ends up getting closed. So what are some things that you as a seller should think about prior to engaging this process? So first thing is, have you cleaned up your financials? And so I talked about a few things earlier that are relevant to this conversation, specifically personal expenses. Are there personal expenses that you're running through the business? Some of those things need to be removed entirely. Some of those things can be adjusted out. Oftentimes, this is going to be around automobiles, health insurance for family members, for your extended family, cell phone bills and so forth that you might be paying for individuals in your family that are not actually part of the business and so forth. But there's also going to be elements around ensuring that there's alignment. So we've seen instances where there's a hardware line item and the sales of hardware is less than the cost associated in the cost of goods sold with the expenses for that hardware. So how can you be spending more in hardware as a cost of goods sold than you're generating in revenue from hardware? Now, there's some time elements, timeline elements to that might be able to address that issue. So namely, if you're in a cash versus an accrual accounting structure, that might account for some of the differential. But in other cases, it's often the fact is that there's been some miscategorization that's been done, or that there's some hardware that you purchased for your own internal purposes, so that's showing up as a cost of goods sold, when in fact it's not associated with your customers and the cost to service those customers. So ensuring that the categorization and line items are cleaned up, and ideally that there's a tie back from cost of goods sold to revenue, and that buyers can understand profitability between different lines of business by looking at their financials. Are your customers on contracts? So buyers are looking for certainty of revenue. They're not looking for just simply a customer base that may or may not continue. They're looking to ensure that customers are, there's a history there, and that ideally, if they're on contracts, that there's a greater sense of security around those customers being there for the long term. And so we've seen situations where there's a 12-month contract, but there's a 30-day cancellation clause. And a 12-month contract with a 30-day cancellation clause is not a whole lot different than a month-to-month customer contract. So first of all, do your customers have contracts? If you don't have those, I highly suggest that you get them in place if at all possible. And secondly, if they do have contracts, what do those outages look like? What do the cancellation clauses look like? And what is the duration? We have many sellers over the years who have told us that, well, I don't have contracts with my customers because they all love doing business with me, and I don't want to force anybody to be on a contract in a situation where it doesn't make sense for them, or that they don't need the service anymore. And my answer to that is there's one thing to be able to run your business in a way that kind of makes it easiest and have it make the most sense for you. But you're now looking at this through a different lens. You're looking at this from the perspective of a buyer who's looking for some certainty. And if there's no certainty, you're going to end up reaping those how do I say that? Be reflective of ultimately the offers that you end up getting, because they're going to need to put in some insurance in case some of those customers end up leaving. Another element that's very important is to ensure that the contracts can be assigned. So if you have contracts in place with your customers, but there's no reference to the fact that if the business is sold, that the buyer can take over those customers' contracts legally and enforce them, then they're really not worth very much, if anything. And so again, buyers can be back to assuming that there essentially is no contract if they can't be assigned. So read the fine print, and again, if that isn't the case, to update your contracts and get your customers to sign new ones where that language has been included. And talked earlier about any special certifications or designations that a buyer must hold, excuse me, to be able to secure those customers long term and be able to provide the support that they're needed. Sometimes this plays out in government contracting roles. And we talked earlier about the tax implications and liabilities associated with the sale, and have you had those conversations with your accountant to ensure that there's no surprises and that you've factored in what you feel you will need in order for your retirement or whatever funding requirements that you have, and the valuations that you end up are hoping to get, and the valuations that you end up receiving are going to be aligned with your tax obligations. I talked earlier about time frames. So do you have a time frame in mind? Do you have a requirement for selling the business within a certain period of time? Is this just an exploratory sort of exercise? And if you can find a buyer that makes sense for you and your business and provides a valuation that seems reasonable, that you'll go ahead. But if it doesn't, that's fine. You'll continue running the business as well. So what are your requirements, and to be clear about those, and that we would need to make sure that we have the same understanding, and that those expectations be sort of set from the beginning. Are you willing to stay on post-close? And if so, for how long and under what terms? So is that full-time employment? Is that, hey, listen, I'll be happy to be a contractor or consultant for some period of time, no more than 20 hours a week, and I'll do it for the first 6 months or a year, but after that, I'd like to transition out. So having those conversations, and it may be that you're flexible to both. If the salary is decent and you like the buyer and there's a good opportunity, that you'll stay. And if not, then you would consider moving on and doing something different. Are you willing to sign a non-compete? So it's very rare that a buyer will move forward with a transaction where a seller is not willing to sign a non-compete. And a non-compete is different than a non-solicit. So non-solicit is a given. You would need to have exclusivity over the buyer need to have exclusivity over those customers, and not being able to, you would not be able to provide any sort of services that are the same as those services that are currently being provided to the customer. But a non-compete would go beyond that to say not just customers you're selling, but that you would not be able to be in the same business or provide the same services or same industry or in the same market as you are right now on a go-forward basis for some period of time. Typically, non-competes are going to be 2 to 5 years. 5 years is often what a buyer will ask for. We find in practice that 3 years is sort of more often what ends up being agreed to. But if you have no interest or intention of being in the space, particularly if you're planning on retiring, it's probably a moot point, because it doesn't really make much difference. And are you willing to dedicate the time needed for this process to be successful? So I think this is an important one, and probably one that a lot of sellers underestimate, is the time that's involved in terms of the preparation of the material and information. But then, of course, having all the conversations with prospective buyers and getting them the information and reports that they need, and then to go through the due diligence process. And this is not just a time from a time of day, but also from a distraction perspective, and a focus, or if you like, dedicated brain time to put into this. And so that's an important question to ask yourself, is that do you have the ability to continue to run your business, because you can't just neglect that, particularly if you're more operational day to day, but then also to be able to conduct this process in addition to everything, so that you can end up staying at a pace that will keep buyers engaged, and that the process will be successful in the end. In the situations that we've had in the past where buyers didn't have the time, they were traveling all the time, the business took too much of their time, or in some cases maybe there's some kind of an issue that arose, some fire that they needed to deal with, and too much time goes by where you're not providing the information that buyers are looking for. Frankly, they just lose interest and move on to the next deal, and so you sort of burned those opportunities. And then have you thought about what sort of personal ties you might have to the business that need to be undone? Maybe there's some family members that work in the business. Maybe there's some families that are customers of yours. Maybe you have email addresses that are tied to your bank accounts or your cell phone account, or they're used as credentials for some personal elements, your password vaults, etc. Are there any company-owned assets that you want or need to keep? Laptop being an obvious example, but it's not always the case. In some cases, particularly with MSPs, there might be a vehicle associated with the business that you wish to keep, etc. So are there any personal items that should be excluded, and having a conversation around those? Sometimes the buyer will be okay with you as the seller keeping the email address that you have associated with the business for some period of time. In other cases, they're not comfortable with that, because then you might get access to information that they don't want you to have from customers, or login credentials or something over time, and so they'll want to terminate that. And so if that's the case, you need to extricate yourself and any of these ties that you have to the business, and be thinking about that in advance. So that really covers a lot of the questions that we would typically cover in a call with sellers that they like to know. It doesn't mean to say that answers all of your questions, but hopefully that gives you an overview. And if you'd like to have a conversation with us, please feel free to reach out, info@thehostbroker.com, and we'll be in touch, and then we can set up a specific conversation and talk about your situation. So I appreciate you making it through this session, and hopefully that helps answer your questions. Thank you.